Welcome back to part 2 of our Bible study in the book of Exodus. We looked last time at Moses' birth, and we're now going to see how God calls him for the ministry for which he is needed. Last time we said that Moses had this very particular circumstances around his birth, which meant that he grew up in a household which shared both Hebrew and Egyptian lineage, but he hadn't perhaps had lived experience of either. And I think that's clear in this first section of the passage that we're looking at today. So in verse 2:11, Moses has grown up and he went out to his people. So there we see that Moses has had this sheltered upbringing. He goes out. And immediately he sees their forced labour. That's what he notices. He notices abuse. He notices oppression. And then he notices an Egyptian beating a Hebrew up. And he knows that one's Egyptian. He knows that one is Hebrew. And he knows that one of those is his kinfolk. But he doesn't perhaps have an appreciation of how either of those have come to be in that position. He doesn't perhaps have an appreciation of the conditions that have led to that abuse, to the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. And so Moses reacts extremely. He looks this way and he looks that, and I love this phrase, he sees no one. He sees no man. The word man, the word person is there in the Hebrew. And I wonder if, this might be reading too much into it, but I wonder if he's looking at that Egyptian and he doesn't see a person. He just sees the abuse. He just sees the oppression. And that's why he responds in the way he does, and he kills the person that is perpetrating that abuse. Now, don't get me wrong, the conditions for the abuse don't excuse the abuser. What the Egyptian does is absolutely wrong, but when we're trying to deal with abuse, when we're trying to move past this relationship of oppressor and oppressed, what we need to do is to see the person, to see the Egyptian, to see the Ish here, and to say what has led that person to betray their own personhood to commit this abuse. Because that's what abuse does. It's an affront, it's an abuse of our own freedom, of our own choices, of the gift of life that has been given to us. We are abusing ourselves when we commit abuse, as well as causing immense pain, suffering, and victimhood to another. So when we see, when Moses sees this man, he doesn't see a person, and he takes that life away, because that's how he sees the only way to solve this problem of abuse. But we quickly see that has far-reaching effects, and very quickly he then comes across two Hebrews fighting. And all of a sudden, it's not quite as simple for Moses. He has to see the people, because now these are both, we're told, his fellows. They already know of his abuse, and they ask him, who made you ruler and judge over us? Of course, the irony is, if we can call it that God will make Moses ruler and judge over the people of Israel. That is exactly what Moses is being formed for and called to here. But in this moment, Moses is not ready for it yet. And so the answer there is he doesn't know. But what he does now know is that these relationships and the way that he makes his decisions is going to be important. Fear leads to death and the loss of life. Moses flees. And in the wilderness, around Egypt, he's going to learn some very important lessons about leadership. And interestingly, for me, he's going to learn them from a shepherd, a priest, a father. And all those three things are going to be relationships that God inhabits for us. And I think that's so interesting that's who Moses encounters when he first flees from the court of Pharaoh. So he meets a priest of Midian with 7 daughters, and quickly he learns that looking after their flock is their lesson for him. How is he going to encourage life but to draw water and to feed them? And again, there's images, there's stories here that we see resonances of in the New Testament as Jesus ministers to us. And so at the end of that period, at the end of chapter 2, we hear how God hears the cries of the people of Israel, remembers his covenant with them, and takes notice of them. That's what Moses has done for those daughters of the priest of Midian and for their flock. And so we know that when God does that for his people, he is looking out for and caring for them. So we see both God and Moses set up in the text here to look after and to show leadership towards the people. And I think it's important that we see that paralleled in God's story as well. And because this is about that free relationship, God doesn't have to save his people, but he wants to, and he wants us to know that he wants to. That's why the text is written in the way that it is. And so what happens at the start of chapter 3? Well, Moses notices something too. He notices that the bush is aflame, but is not consumed. And so he stops, he turns aside, he looks at the burning bush, and he hears the voice of God in it. And God invites him to remember as well the stories that he knows about his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this voice speaking to him says that he is their God, and therefore he is Moses' God. So Moses does some remembering as well. And it's only because he had that upbringing in Pharaoh's court under the nurture of his mother that he knows those stories, he knows those names, and he knows that relationship. You see, the context from which Moses comes is fundamental to how God can relate to him, and that goes for us in our ministry too. We shouldn't be trying to forget or cast off our context and our learning and our experiences to date just because we think God wants us to do something. Even if he wants us to do something new, he's going to take our experiences and use them to inform how we are as ministers and as missioners. Where is Moses at this point? He's on the Mount of Horeb, and that's important. That's going to be a boundary for God, because God is going to bring Moses back to Horeb at some point, and that's going to be proof and vindication for Moses that God has done what he has said he will. And for us, I've said we're going to read up to the middle of chapter 20. That's when the Israelites get back to Horeb and they receive the 10 Commandments, and the rest of Exodus takes place around Horeb, and there's various other things that happen there. But we're gonna draw a line at the end of the journey there, partly because it rounds off the narrative quite nicely. God promises to bring Moses back to Horeb, and he does. And so we'll finish there later on at the end of August. But of course, the story is not finished, and God indicates that here, that there's another promise involved, a promise to bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. That list comes quite a number of times throughout these books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Why? Because they sound exotic. They sound somewhere far off. They are to the Hebrews under the Egyptians, but of course this is a land that their ancestors have known already. Abraham has travelled through these places. Jacob has lived amongst them. So they shouldn't be far off lands. They should feel like home, but a home that they're not in yet, and that's where that promise comes from, and that is the promise for us. God calls us to be in his kingdom, a place that should feel like home, but somewhere we know we are not yet. And God establishes some equality in his relationship with Moses. So God has called Moses by name. Moses, Moses, he says, and Moses says, "Here I am." And God replies to him by revealing his own name. Now, the name that God gives him is translated in the NRSV, "I am who I am." It'll be translated in different ways in different versions of the Bible. And it's even written in a very particular way in my Bible, all in lower capitals. So it's clear that this is a name which we should treat respectfully, reverentially. It has great significance and great importance. Indeed, in Judaism, you wouldn't be able to say it or to write it, and you mustn't destroy paper that's had it or anything alluding to it on. But what we do get, so Moses reveals this name, "I am who I am," and then he says, "I am has sent me to you," and then he says, "The Lord, the God of your ancestors, has sent me to you." And so we work our way to the fact that the Lord is what we use as a euphemism for God's name. So we're not allowed to say God's name in Judaism. As Christians, we do sometimes say it, Yahweh, or the letters YHWH. That's the divine name. It seems to be linked to the verb to be. That's why it's translated "I am." But in the Old Testament, that word is written over the word Adonai, the Lord. So every time you see the Lord, often written in small caps as well, what you're seeing there is the word for the divine name. And we haven't seen that yet in the book of Exodus. So that's been reserved in the book of Exodus until God reveals it to Moses. We have seen it in the book of Genesis, but not in Exodus. And notice that there's a lovely parallel, because God calls Moses by name, and Moses says, "Here I am," and God then reveals to Moses that his name is "I am" as well. So there's a wonderful sort of equivalence in their relationship. And I think that's important. We talked about covenant as free association, as entering willingly into partnership. And we're seeing, I think, Moses and God work that out here. And most important for that equivalence, for that parity in relationship, is knowing and understanding one another and feeling known and seen and understood. And we do that at a most basic level by sharing our name. Finally, then, we move on to what God wants of Moses. And Moses, if we look at verse 3:19 onwards, recognises that the king of Egypt is strong, has power, has a mighty hand. He says, "So I too," verse 20, "will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it." And that word power or hand is going to be important throughout this early part of the book book of Exodus. So it's the same word, power, hand, yod in Hebrew. It's a very short word, a small word. In fact, it's the letter I, so it's a very old word in Hebrew. It means power, means hand. Notice we've actually already had it. Moses delivered the sheep of the priest of Midian's daughters out of the shepherd's hand, out of the shepherd's power. So whenever you see this word hand or power throughout this early part of Exodus, just know that they are the same word, and that again becomes an image that we use of God quite regularly, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. The psalmist says God delivered his people Israel. And remember, we said that the book of Exodus is going to be about how we handle power well. That's introduced here. God recognizes that he will need to use his power, use his hand to free Israel. And we'll see that gets used in a very literal sense as well as a figurative sense. So when we get to chapter 4, Moses is given these signs of power, which are to do with physically using his hand to begin with. He's going to hold a staff, and that's going to become a snake. He's holding it in his hand. The power is in his hand. Then later on, again, it's going to be even clearer. He's going to put his hand inside his cloak and his hand will wither. The power, the hand will fade away, but the power is still there. He'll bring it out again and it will be restored. But that is an association, a play on words that the Hebrew people will understand, because the word for hand and the word for power are the same. It's not one that the Egyptians will necessarily understand. So Moses is given another sign, which is to do with the Egyptian source of power, which is to do with the water from the Nile, and that will become blood. So we can see that God is using these images that the people will understand, that become fundamental for us as Christians, around power, around the hand. And I think that's important, and we will see that play out. Moses then, in humility, still says that he's not the one to bring this message to Pharaoh, and I think again God has probably chosen Moses deliberately. He's uncircumcised of mouth is what the text says about Moses. Perhaps he has some sort of speech impediment, perhaps having grown up in a very sheltered place in Pharaoh's court, learning both Hebrew and Egyptian. Perhaps the problem is that he's not completely fluent in a form of Egyptian that Pharaoh is going to understand, nor a form of Hebrew that the people will understand. He's got this sort of mixed race, mixed heritage, mixed accent, mixed linguistic ability. Whatever the problem is, Moses is humble enough to acknowledge that, to the extent that God gets angry with him, and so Aaron, Moses' brother, is introduced seemingly from nowhere. We've put a lot of time into working out who Moses is, what his birth story is, what his story of his call is, and Aaron just appears almost out of nowhere. Why? Because Aaron is the check to Moses' humility. If we're telling these stories about Moses, telling everyone how great Moses is, how important it is to understand the context from which he's come and how God's used him and formed him, the check is Aaron, who is there because Moses needs him. And we don't need to know any more than that. That's Moses' call and Aaron's call. They're still not quite ready to go and speak to Pharaoh yet. They will be commissioned is the word I've used. That's not a Hebrew word. But I want to say something that the next passage that we'll look at is about Moses living into that call, accepting that call, personalizing that call, and being prepared to live it out. And again, when we're thinking about our own ministry, that's something that we have to go through. What will this ministry that God has called me to look like for me in the context in which I'm set. Well, we'll see what that is for Moses and for Aaron next time. Thank you for joining me.